So this morning I got to thinking about the Stoa topic, and if I were coaching on this topic, what kinds of affirmatives would I be suggesting to my debaters that they go out and see if they could find? Now, the first thing I want to say is there's really limited utility to making up your mind what kind of affirmative you're looking for and then going and finding it. And at the end of this video, I'm going to repeat what I think is the smart thing to do when you first have a brand new debate topic. But you can take some of the templates that have worked in the past and keep them in mind and see if they'll come together again. And as long as you're doing both, as long as you're letting what's out there, what's being written about, guide you, it is okay to take your knowledge of what sort of arguments are very, very useful and put you in a good strategic position and let that be part of your planning and your early season strategizing. So with that in mind, I have 3 suggestions that you might go investigate and see if you can piece together for advanced debaters. And then one that I think would be very, very good for beginner debaters and could conceivably be pretty hard to beat for advanced debaters as well. So the first thing that I think that I would do is I would tell debaters that I was coaching to go and see about China. This would be if you liked your affirmative big. But here's how I think you would do it. I think you would start off by writing a very simple, straightforward, easily explained version that was, if the literature supported this, along the lines of China is trying to expand, China is becoming a world power, China wants to be the regional hegemon, and it's important that the United States check that expansion without setting China off and triggering an arms race. And so the particular strategic adjustments we need to make to where we are an effective counterbalance to China are these. And that would be the plan, and that would be what the solvency evidence said, and you would have a very big advantage. You could conceivably say this is the only really likely superpower military showdown that's likely to happen in the world that we live in today. So this impact dwarfs anything that the negative can win on their disadvantages. And then what I think you would do over the course of the season, this is something that I've seen a lot of debaters do over the years, is you take that narrative and you refine it. And you add wrinkles and you add nuance and sophistication and you start to turn it into China's very specific strategy is to gain access to the Spratly Islands, for example. That they want to be the major client state coordinator, the major client state boss in Africa. There are various specific and sort of not obvious ways that they are trying to carry out a strategy to expand their power in the world, and then you say that the United States' moves in the world run the risk of leading China to miscalculate. And so how you explain international relations gets more and more sophisticated. Now you do this as you move into the year for a couple of reasons. You make it very simple at the beginning of the year so that you get practice explaining these things to where recent events, the names of Chinese leaders, the names of Chinese institutions just roll off your tongue and you understand them very well, and that's battle tested in lots of debates. You also do it so that at least some of your judging pool that you're seeing on a regular basis, they know the earlier version of your affirmative and they see how the affirmative is continuing to evolve. And this becomes something where you're the expert, you know kind of the ins and outs, and you know what adjustments to make to the narrative of what China is trying to do and what will happen if the United States doesn't respond appropriately to make a lot of the negatives arguments not very relevant. So if they try to read evidence about how China is expanding its military, but its military technology is not as advanced as ours, well, you can kind of get around that and say, but what China's trying to do right now is more of an international relations, build up alliances phase of the strategy, and they're biding their time, and they're letting their economy grow to the point where they can afford advanced technology, and they're having more and more of their students who study over in the United States come back home. So give it a few years, and their technology is not going to be behind ours. And in that way, you don't have to have a card that says no for every card they have that says yes. You can say, their arguments miss the point. Our explanation of what it is that China is attempting to carry out in the world is a lot more nuanced than theirs, and their arguments are broad spectrum and generic and have nothing to do with the argument that we're making. So, that's what I think the first bit of advice I'd give my debaters would be. See if you can't, for the beginning of the season, write an affirmative talking about how China is growing into a power and we need to counterbalance them, and then watch for laying the foundation for how later in the season this is going to evolve and become a lot more sophisticated. The second affirmative that I think I would look into is I would look into unmanned drones. We're using them in a lot of battlefield environments. There are at least some things being written about how they might violate international law. There are some things being written about how they change the equation as far as us having to commit troops, which is the reason I think out of all these affirmatives I'm going to talk about, this is the one that's the most clearly topical. And I wouldn't really know what shape it was going to take, whether it might be that we will use... I think it would be one of those where the affirmative did not have a straightforward direction to it. It would be that we are going to use drones more, but in correct situations. So we're going to come into compliance with battlefield, with the laws of war, so that we're not undercutting those. But we're also going to use them in situations where we haven't used them before, and we're going to get better and continue to innovate them and expand the use of them. And then I think you can make a pretty sophisticated argument about how, complying with the laws of war, that's necessary for coalition building for the future, that where there are military interventions, they're inevitable, and military interventions can go badly or they can go well, and the United States needs to have in place the procedures that let us apply overwhelming strength without taking the kinds of troubling losses that undercut public support for the war. But we need to know how to use this new kind of weapon, but not use it in a way that we turn the rest of the world against us. And I think that's kind of a savvy affirmative where negatives couldn't very easily pin it down into, well, this is an increased force or decreased force. It's actually sort of an increase in our strength. It's sort of a force multiplier, but it's also using it a lot more precisely instead of using it in the status quo. It's haphazard. And the good thing about that affirmative is it leaves the negative to defend that it's good to have haphazard use of unmanned drones. So the third affirmative suggestion that I have is really kind of similar in how it plays out strategically to the second, but the subject matter is completely different. I think what you could do, and actually I think the way you would execute this in a lot of debates would be different. What you would do is you would look into what are the policies that the Defense Department, that the different branches in the military have, in particular the, not the Navy, well maybe the Navy, but what are the policies that they have for how many times a soldier can be deployed, how many times a soldier is sent back to a battlefield environment, and you make basically the argument that we are overusing and burning out our soldiers. And in the 1AC, what you do is you cite some of the more shocking numbers, and those numbers are definitely out there, about how many times we send people back to a battlefield environment when they've got head injuries, how many times we send them back after promising them they're not going to go back. And really the narrative is something like, the American soldier, our American fighting force, we're doing them wrong. And then in the 2AC, the logical negative argument, if you have a set of reforms that checks how often soldiers will be sent back into battlefield environments, the bait that you're dangling in front of the negative is to get them to try to debate you on effectiveness. What are we going to do if we don't have enough troops? We're doing all of that because we have to have boots on the ground. Well then, in the 2AC, you can hold back arguments about declining morale and what that does to preparedness. And over the years, a lot of teams have had that debate, and it's a debate that the affirmative is well positioned to win. And you can talk, and another thing you might do is you can find people talking in this kind of reform literature about how if you check the number of troops that are available, then if you limit the number of troops that are available, then that puts the military under a lot of pressure to change what it is, to change their tactics, to have a leaner, smarter force. You might be able to say that would encourage the shift to use of unmanned drones, to using more non-lethal weapons for battlefield control, that there would be a change in tactics as a result, and that you could link turn those arguments and say that you'd be even more effective. So, those three arguments are the ones I think I would send my advanced debaters out to try to put together. Now, a good argument that I think you could prepare for your novice debaters would simply be for the United States to stop using landmines. Now, the reason that I think that's a good affirmative is because the entire set of issues that you have to debate is very limited. And what you can do is you can become the expert. You can study very hard to where any argument you're going to hear, you know right away, these are the 4 or 5 answers I make, this is where I want the issue to be in the last rebuttal, and you can concentrate on getting it together on your technical skills. What I have seen with, as far as affirmatives that I don't think work that well for novices, those are the affirmatives where there are a lot of arguments that they're not going to see coming. There are going to be a lot of arguments that take them by surprise, because it's a terrifying experience when you're brand new to debate. You're not sure what to say, how to say it, what's going to happen by the end of the debate if you make certain moves, and then when it comes to the substance of the debate, you're hearing arguments you're not prepared for. That can really leave a bad taste in the mouth of a novice. But on the topics in the past where taking the landmines debate has been topical, that's a good, confined debate, because there just aren't that many arguments that the negative can make. Now, I'm not saying some of them aren't compelling, and I'm not saying you'll win all the time. I am saying it's pretty tilted in favor of the affirmative, and it's a very kind of aesthetically pleasing affirmative for judges to think about no longer using landmines, especially when they hear what landmines do to children and children with amputated limbs and so forth. It's possible that that might be the kind of hard to beat affirmative that you start out with your novices running, and later in the year you have your more advanced debaters switch over to it because, heck, it's got a good track record. One last thing, well, two last things I want to say. The first is, I am a genuine believer that you should have more than one affirmative. Now, I'm not saying you have to have 9 affirmatives. That's pretty common at the college level. I've heard some really good reasons why in the Stoa and NCFCA and those kinds of leagues, having fewer affirmatives is a much better idea, but I think it's a good idea to have at least 2 and to start doing practice debates on those 2 from the beginning of the year. Sometimes you need to just change the equation. Sometimes the way you're debating on a particular weekend, one affirmative is just not breaking for you. Sometimes you might have a club there and they're talking to one another and they've really got your number on the one affirmative, and so you need a backup plan, and it can't be something that you try to throw it together, you try to get up to speed on quickly, but if you start from the beginning of the year, dual capable, and you make your affirmatives kind of different. I think what I would do is I would take the China affirmative, if it comes together, and the troop rotation affirmative, the third one I talked about, if it comes together. The troop rotation affirmative could be really, really appealing to parent judges and community judges because you're talking about we are not doing right by our soldiers. And you could include maybe one good narrative in there of a family, not good narrative, but one really heartbreaking narrative about a family torn apart by this kind of action, this kind of almost callous indifference to the needs of the troops and to the needs of their families. And if you had those 2 capabilities, then you have the one where you've got really kind of highly complex, nuanced explanations, and the other one where it's just very straightforward, and the judge at the end of the 1AC wants to vote affirmative and just knows that, to be fair, they have to listen to the negative, but they're already leaning in your direction. And I think each of those, if you have both of those in your arsenal, then you're really pretty well positioned. The last thing I want to say, all of this speculation, all of this, these would be things that we would brainstorm in our early meetings, but if I was coaching on this topic, we would start by going and doing a sweep of the library. We would go and we would find the Library of Congress numbers for United States military policy, for United States foreign relations, and we would go book by book down the shelves looking at anything that was in the past few years. We would go to particular journals and we would leaf through article by article every issue for the past several years, and we would see for ourselves what is being written about, and we would do that before we made any firm decision to give out research assignments or to commit to an affirmative. And there are various places, more detailed descriptions of how I think that process ought to work, and you can track them down without too much problem. If you're having trouble finding one, you can email me and I can send you to one. But the sweep, doing the sweep at the beginning of the season so that you know what's out there, that is the kind of thing that a championship program ought to be doing every year. So this is the perfect time of year for you to take a little time and do that. I know you have NITOC coming up, but that's still the kind of thing that can get you a very, very thorough foundation and keep you from falling prey to surprises at the beginning of the season. So it's a wise move, and I hope you'll give it some consideration, and I hope that these other affirmative ideas help stir up your thinking in some productive ways.